Even now, when the night air stirs with the faintest sound, people still whisper that one secret of St. Mary Mead remains alive, but the face of that secret belonged to someone who was once the most trusted, and just when he thought he understood everything, his dark truth came to light. A murderer, a friendship, a conspiracy, everything tied together. But what we saw was only a small piece of the whole puzzle. Now that the secret has been exposed, can we handle the truth, or is there something even deeper lurking within St. Mary Mead, waiting to be understood? Under the muted light of a grey afternoon sky, the Finch estate stood in sombre silence, its former grandeur diminished but still faintly visible in the weathered stone and crumbling brickwork. A long winding gravel drive led up to the house, flanked by overgrown hedges and a garden of roses whose blooms had withered, leaving behind only memories of their former vibrancy. The ivy that clung to the house's walls seemed to whisper secrets of the past, of better days, as if the estate itself were still holding on to its dignity. It was a house that spoke of its age, yet remained steadfast. Miss Agatha Marple stepped out of the hired motor car, her hat's brim adjusted with a slow, deliberate motion as her eyes scanned the surroundings. There was something unnerving about the place, an eerie stillness that clung to the air, thick with unsaid things. It was as though the house was holding its breath, much like Harriet Finch, who stood in the doorway, her face drawn, her posture betraying a sense of quiet fatigue. The trial had worn her down, leaving traces of sleepless nights, whispered rumors, and a suffocating pressure that threatened to swallow her whole. Yet, here on her land, she seemed to find a moment's reprieve, as though the weight of the world hadn't followed her through the threshold. "Come in." Harriet's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, as though the house itself might overhear her. Miss Marple entered, her movements light but purposeful, her eyes taking in every detail. The hallway was lined with portraits of Finch ancestors, each painted face telling a different story, some serene, others holding an air of quiet disapproval. Harriet led Miss Marple further into the house, her fingers trailing lightly over the dark wood of the banister, as if searching for something she could no longer name. "Everything feels so unfamiliar now," Harriet murmured, her voice tinged with a sadness she couldn't quite suppress. "I grew up here, you know, played in the gardens, had my first arguments with Ronald in the drawing room." Miss Marple nodded quietly. "People never quite understand," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience that a house remembers even when its occupants try to forget. Harriet paused at a side door, her shoulders tense. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely audible. "The shed is this way." They stepped outside, the cold of the afternoon air biting at their skin, and found themselves standing in front of a garden that had long since lost its former beauty. Flower beds now lay in disarray, tangled ivy creeping over the stone paths, the once lush greenery now withered. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, aged wood, and decay. Miss Marple took it all in, her mind already at work, seeking out the unseen threads of mystery woven between the walls of the estate. At the edge of the garden stood a small wooden shed, its roof sagging under the weight of ivy, the padlock on the door barely hanging on. Harriet paused, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "They say the poison came from here." Miss Marple did not immediately respond, but instead entered the shed, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood, damp burlap, and dried herbs, remnants of a life that had long since faded. Gardening tools hung from rusted hooks, sacks of potting soil sat against the walls, and a small workbench cluttered with forgotten odds and ends stood in the corner. Yet, despite the disarray, nothing seemed out of place. There were no overturned bottles, no spilled chemicals, no trace of anything that could be linked to poison. Miss Marple ran a gloved finger over a shelf, lifting a trace of dust. "Tell me, Harriet," she said, her tone mild but probing, "did you ever keep the Donna here?" Harriet blinked, her confusion evident. "No, never. I grew some at the far end of the garden once, but I never kept it here. Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the shed with practiced precision. Then that's curious, isn't it? She mused, her finger tapping lightly on the frame of a low shelf. Harriet frowned, her anxiety growing. What do you mean? Miss Marple straightened, brushing the dust from her gloves with a casual air. If the poison did not come from here, my dear, she said softly, one has to wonder why someone would want it to appear as though it did. Harriet stiffened, her eyes widening as the implications of Miss Marple's words began to sink in. In that moment, Miss Marple saw the truth emerge from the shadows, deliberate, carefully crafted, and expertly hidden. The truth had been shaped to lead them in a single direction, a direction that perhaps no one was ever meant to follow. Miss Marple's gaze dropped to the floor near the entrance, where something small but unexpected caught her eye. A faint scuff mark, almost imperceptible, marred the dust near the threshold. It wasn't the mark of boots, tools, or spilled soil. It was the kind left by a shoe, twisting slightly as someone hesitated at the doorway. A man's shoe, perhaps. For the first time, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Miss Marple rose with quiet certainty, her gaze meeting Harriet's with a knowing look. My dear, she said calmly, I believe this garden shed has been very carefully staged. Harriet exhaled sharply, her breath hitching in her chest as realization flickered in her wide eyes. You mean someone put the poison here on purpose? Miss Marple's faint smile was devoid of warmth. Oh my dear, she murmured, that was precisely the idea. The shed, silent as a confessional, held its secrets in the dust-filled air, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail. She wasn't looking for what was there, but for what was missing, because a tidy crime was always the most suspect. Her gloved fingers brushed lightly over a row of glass jars, their contents long since turned to powder. Nearby, a wooden crate sat, containing bottles that had once held pesticides and plant nutrients, their labels faded and nearly unreadable. The evidence was there, in plain sight, yet it was the absence, the things left behind, that told the real story. The Finch estate, though aged and weathered, still bore an air of former grandeur, a silent testament to its past. The gravel drive, now uneven, snaked its way through overgrown hedges, and a garden long forgotten, its once vibrant roses now faded and barely clinging to life. The house itself, a stately Georgian structure, stood against the grey sky, ivy creeping up its stone walls, the windows dark and distant, like eyes that had seen too much. As Miss Agatha Marple stepped from the hired motor car, she adjusted the brim of her hat, her gaze sweeping the estate with quiet precision, as if weighing the heavy silence that lingered in the air. The stillness of the place was unnerving, a palpable tension hanging in the crisp afternoon air, almost as though it were holding its breath, mirroring the woman standing at the door, Harriet Finch. Harriet, though still striking, appeared thinner, her posture slumped, her usual grace replaced with a tired, almost defeated composure. The trial had drained her, the long hours of sleepless nights, the whispers and stares, the suffocating weight of suspicion pressing in from every corner. Yet, here, within the familiar walls of her childhood home, she seemed momentarily grounded, as if the very earth beneath her feet might still tether her to a life that felt far out of reach. Come in, she said, her voice low, as if she feared the house itself might hear her words. Miss Marple followed her, her steps deliberate and measured, the grand hallway stretching out before them, lined with portraits of the Finch family past, their painted eyes seeming to follow every movement with a disapproving gaze. Harriet led her toward the back of the house, her fingers trailing absently over the dark wood of the banister, as if searching for some familiar comfort. It feels so different, Harriet murmured, her voice almost a whisper. I grew up here, you know, ran through those gardens, argued with Ronald in that very drawing room. Miss Marple nodded, her sharp eyes taking in the details, recognizing the weight of memory in every word, every step. You know, Miss Marple said softly. Some houses remember, even when their owners wish they didn't. Harriet paused near a side door, her body tensing slightly, as though bracing herself for something unknown. "The shed's this way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They stepped outside into the chill of the afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The garden, once meticulously tended, now lay in disarray, its flower beds wilting, the stone paths obscured by creeping ivy. The smell of aged wood and soil clung to the air, a reminder of the years that had passed since life had truly flourished here. Miss Marple, however, did not seem to notice the decay. Her mind was already working, her sharp eyes scanning for something that wasn't immediately visible, patterns, gaps, anything out of place. The shed itself was small, nestled at the far edge of the garden, its roof sagging under the weight of creeping ivy. The padlock on the door was loose, barely hanging on, yet unfastened. Harriet hesitated before speaking, her words thick with a strange sense of unease. "They say the poison came from here." Miss Marple's silence was her answer, but she stepped inside, her gloved hand brushing against the doorframe as she entered. The wooden floor creaked under her weight, the air inside musty with the scent of old wood, dried herbs and forgotten tools. Gardening implements hung on rusted hooks, bags of potting soil leaned against the walls, and a small workbench sat in the corner, cluttered with empty jars, brittle twine, and remnants of forgotten projects. Yet, despite the disarray, nothing appeared to have been disturbed. No spilled chemicals, no missing bottles, no trace of anything remotely toxic. Miss Marple ran a finger along a dusty shelf, her gloved hand lifting a thin trace of undisturbed dust. "Tell me, Harriet," she asked in her mild voice, "did you ever keep any belladonna here?" Harriet blinked in surprise. "No, I grew some in the far garden once, but never stored it here." Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully, her finger tapping lightly against a wooden shelf. "Then that is curious, isn't it?" she said, her tone implying she already knew the answer. Harriet frowned, confusion written across her face. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple straightened, brushing dust from her gloves as she surveyed the room one last time. "If the poison didn't come from here, my dear," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "one must wonder why someone would want to make it seem as though it did." The words hung in the air like a cold gust of wind, and in that moment, Miss Marple's eyes fell to the floorboards near the entrance. A faint scuff mark caught her attention, small, almost imperceptible, but telling. A mark made not by a tool, not by boots but by a shoe, a man's shoe perhaps. Her mind, ever sharp, clicked into place. "This shed," she said, rising gracefully, her eyes now gleaming with certainty, "has been staged, Harriet, carefully staged." Harriet exhaled sharply, her breath catching as the realization flickered in her wide eyes. "You mean someone put the poison here on purpose?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, though it carried no warmth. "Oh my dear, that was precisely the idea." The truth was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. This carefully constructed scene had been designed, not just to mislead, but to disguise the true nature of the crime. A crime that had been orchestrated with precision, and one that now, with each passing moment, was drawing closer to its perpetrator. Miss Marple's eyes shifted, scanning the room for anything further, any hint, any trace that might give her more to work with. Her hand hovered over a row of glass jars, their contents long since turned to dust, and she knew the deception ran deeper than she had first realized. Something had been removed. The evidence, carefully planted, had been tampered with, and in that tampering, a vital clue had been hidden away. It was not belladonna that had been used to kill Ronald Harding, but something far more mundane, far more accessible. Hydrochloric solution, a chemical for treating soil acidity. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning, and she straightened with a look of quiet satisfaction. The evidence was irrelevant, carefully constructed to mislead, and Miss Marple had only to follow the trail of deception to find the truth. Harriet's breath caught in her throat as Miss Marple turned to her, her mind already racing. "You see, my dear," Miss Marple said with a soft smile, "the prosecution's case is about to become very troublesome indeed." Harriet's gaze flickered with a mixture of hope and fear as she whispered, "You mean it wasn't from here? The poison?" Miss Marple's mind was already working, her thoughts racing as she pieced together the lies and manipulations. The poison had been placed in Ronald Harding's teacup deliberately, but not by Harriet. No, someone else had carefully shaped this narrative, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she realized the web of deception was even more tangled than she had thought. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy along the stone walls, whispering a warning, as though the very estate itself was alive with secrets. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her expression calm yet determined. It was time to find the real bottle of poison, and more importantly, it was time to face Barnaby Green. In the drawing room, Harriet sat across from Miss Marple, her hands nervously tugging at her lace cuff. Miss Marple regarded her with a quiet, penetrating gaze, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The evidence against Harriet had been constructed with care, designed to lead to a single inevitable conclusion, but Miss Marple was not so easily deceived. There was more at play here, and it was time to uncover who was truly responsible for the death of Ronald Harding. Harriet sat in silence, her eyes locked on the untouched tea, the steam rising in delicate swirls. The room was charged, the stillness heavy, as Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with an almost predatory precision. Arguments. Miss Marple's voice was a mere whisper, but the tension in it was palpable. Harriet's breath trembled slightly, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her cup. Her mind reeled back to the heated discussions with Ronald Harding, a man driven by an insatiable thirst for opportunities, often pushing his ambitions too far, too quickly. But Levington, a man Ronald had often clashed with, was different. Levington didn't tolerate disrespect, Harriet muttered, her voice barely audible. He didn't like to be crossed. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her lips pressing together as if she already knew the answer. The familiar scent of trouble wafted through the air. The scent of men blinded by power and greed, tangled in deals that turned dark with betrayal. Miss Marple had seen it all before, men whose egos collided and led to terrible accidents, and yet something about the situation felt different. There was one name that lingered, haunting the edges of her thoughts: Barnaby Green. He had been there from the start, too deliberate in his actions, too perfect in his timing to be a mere bystander. Had Barnaby used Ronald's death as a perfect opportunity for revenge, spinning the tale to fit his own desires? Or was the truth more sinister, that Mr. Levington had played a role in shaping the tragedy, with Barnaby unknowingly tipping the scales of justice, ensuring that Harriet, instead of Levington, would bear the guilt? The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together perfectly. The poison had not come from the garden shed, the will had been altered, suggesting a motive that was perhaps fabricated, and Barnaby, sitting comfortably in the jury box, had a look of satisfaction that could not be ignored. His calm demeanor belied a satisfaction that unsettled Miss Marple. She had her answer now. She didn't need any more clues. What remained was to prove it. Turning to Harriet, her expression calm, her eyes filled with a quiet certainty, Miss Marple spoke, her words dripping with resolve. "My dear, I believe I know exactly what has happened." Harriet's heart skipped a beat, her hand trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "You do?" she asked, her voice faltering. Miss Marple smiled, a soft, knowing expression that spoke of countless mysteries solved in the shadows of her own mind. "Oh yes," she said, her voice light, but carrying the weight of finality, "and I intend to see that the right person hangs for it." The courtroom held its breath, the silence stretched, thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were aware of the pivotal moment about to unfold. Outside, storm clouds swelled, pressing against the high windows, casting long dark shadows across the mahogany paneling of the chamber. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, the weight of truth and deception colliding. On the penultimate day of the trial, the eyes of every person in the room, the judge, the court clerks, the jury, even the eager pressmen at the back, were fixed on the events about to unfold. Miss Agatha Marple, ever the observer, sat poised in her usual seat in the gallery, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes never leaving Barnaby Green, whose composure was flawless, yet there was something in the air that suggested even he felt the stirrings of uncertainty today. His unreadable face betrayed no emotion, but Miss Marple suspected that his time of triumph was coming to an end. Mr. Parton Stout, methodical and deliberate as ever, slowly rose from his chair. His deliberate movements filled the room with a sense of purpose. A man who understood that silence could be as powerful as words. He stretched the pause between his rise and his first words just long enough to allow the anticipation to grow. "My lord," he said, his voice steady, addressing the judge, "the defense wishes to introduce a piece of evidence that has only now come to light." The air in the room seemed to shift, a ripple of interest sweeping through the audience. Fresh evidence, at this stage of the trial, was almost unheard of. Even Barnaby Green, ever so controlled, subtly shifted in his seat, though he quickly masked his reaction. Mr. Parton Stout produced a folded document, slightly creased, the ink unmistakably genuine. "A letter," he declared, holding it up for all to see. "Written by Ronald Harding the night before his death." The words landed like a thunderclap in the tense silence that followed. Harriet's breath caught in her throat, her face paling as she looked down at the letter. The judge frowned deeply, but gave the go-ahead, and the courtroom fell even quieter. Parton unfolded the letter with the kind of care that suggested its importance. "If the court permits," he said, pausing for effect, "I shall read it aloud." And then he did. "My dear Harriet, I fear I have been a fool these past years, too stubborn, too caught up in old grievances and foolish pride. I do not wish to leave this world with any debts of the soul unpaid, and I should like to set things right between us. I have spoken to my solicitor about the Finchland. It should be yours, as it was always meant to be. We shall discuss it properly tomorrow, but for now know this: I wish for reconciliation, not strife. Ronald." A deep hush fell over the room as the last words lingered in the air. Harriet's lips parted, her hand shaking as it gripped the railing of the dock. The emotional weight of the letter hung heavy in the room. Even Julian Graves, the prosecution's stalwart, seemed momentarily thrown off by the sudden turn, but it was Mr. Parton Stout who seized the moment. Lowering the letter, his expression remained neutral, but his eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. "This," he said, addressing the jury, "is not the letter of a man who wished to sever ties with his cousin, nor of a man who feared Harriet Finch. This is the letter of a man who, by all accounts, intended to make amends." The effect was immediate and profound. The room seemed to breathe again, but this time, the air was thick with the revelation of truth. The carefully constructed facade of guilt was now slipping away, and the trial, once bound by deceit, was heading toward an unexpected conclusion. The room was thick with tension as the courtroom fell into a collective, almost suffocating silence. Harriet sat, pale yet with a flicker of hope, the weight of her fate shifting before her eyes. For days the narrative had been carefully constructed. Harriet, the embittered relation, driven by a thirst for vengeance over a lost inheritance, a woman whose entire existence seemed bent on revenge. But now that well-crafted tale was unraveling, crumbling under the pressure of a single piece of evidence that refused to bend to the expectations of those who had sought to shape it. Miss Marple, however, seemed indifferent to the gasps rippling through the room. Her gaze was locked, unwavering, on Barnaby Green. For a man who had remained so composed, so controlled, the shift in his demeanor was subtle but damning. It was as if a dark shadow passed over his face for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something far more ominous than surprise. His jaw clenched, his hands tensed just enough to reveal a trace of anxiety, a single brief glance, his eyes flickering not to the damning letter, but to the prosecution's table, and in that fleeting instant, Miss Marple saw the truth she needed to see. He knew that this letter, the one that could have shattered everything, should have never seen the light of day, knew that Harriet's once unshakable conviction was no longer as solid as it appeared, and most telling of all, Miss Marple could feel the chill that emanated from Barnaby in that very moment, a man who, despite his best efforts to control the narrative, had just lost his grip on it. A tiny, barely perceptible shift, but a shift nonetheless. As the judge cleared his throat and addressed the prosecution, it became clear that Barnaby Green's calm facade was beginning to crack. "Mr. Graves," the judge intoned, "I assume you wish to respond." Julian Graves, ever the professional, straightened his cuffs and spoke with a smoothness that was as polished as his marble-like composure. "A deeply moving letter, certainly," he said, his voice a practiced calm. "But words alone do not negate evidence, my lord." And with that, the trial took another turn. A letter written before his death does not change the simple, undeniable fact that Ronald Harding was poisoned. Graves continued, his voice smooth, unshaken, as though he was still confident that the truth of the matter lay in facts, not words. "A letter does not alter the timeline, nor does it explain away the hard evidence." As he spoke, Barnaby Green nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a private understanding between himself and the prosecutor. The gesture was so subtle it could have easily been missed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Miss Marple, sharp as ever, caught it, and so did two of the jurors. Her gaze flicked briefly toward them, catching the brief flash of doubt that crossed their faces, the hint of hesitation in their eyes. The game had changed, and Miss Marple, ever so serene, was already calculating her next move. It was as if the puzzle pieces were falling into place with a clarity that only she could perceive. The courtroom adjourned shortly thereafter, the air still thick with the residue of tension. Harriet, her heart racing but her resolve growing firmer, was escorted from the room, her steps lighter than when she had entered. The reporters were already scribbling madly, rewriting their headlines as the story began to morph before their very eyes. Barnaby Green, too, rose slowly from his seat, his movements measured and precise. But as he passed Miss Marple's seat, the ever-quiet voice of the elderly detective floated toward him. "A rather inconvenient letter, wouldn't you say, Mr. Green?" The words were soft, but they carried a weight that he could not ignore. For a fraction of a second, Barnaby hesitated. His eyes flickered with calculation, as though he were weighing his options, working through the possibilities, the consequences. And then, almost imperceptibly, the faintest of smiles tugged at the corner of his lips. It was not a smile of amusement, but one of recognition, the smile of a man who knew exactly who had just seen through his carefully constructed mask. Miss Marple, in turn, returned the smile, a subtle gesture, her eyes gleaming with quiet confidence as she tucked her knitting bag beneath her arm. She was ready, and she knew that the next move would be hers. Outside, the press clamored, the air heavy with anticipation. The judge, his patience now wearing thin, struck his gavel once, twice, summoning order. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, had eyes only for Barnaby Green, and for the first time in the trial, she saw the crack in his armor. It was small, imperceptible to anyone else, but to Miss Marple, it was everything. Barnaby Green's jaw clenched, not in concentration, but in frustration, the kind that a man who had been cornered might feel when faced with the inevitable. A muscle twitched near his temple, and his fingers tightened around the stub of his pencil, the grip so tight it could have snapped the wood. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, but Miss Marple didn't see a man considering evidence. She saw a man who was scrambling, recalculating, trying to regain control. Her eyes never left him, the calm of her demeanor, masking the sharp focus with which she observed him. And then, in a moment so quick and sharp it might have been imagined, Barnaby's gaze lifted, locking onto hers. The recognition was immediate, raw and unmistakable, and in that single fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw something darker than mere recognition in his eyes, a flicker of fury, an emotion so powerful, so volatile, that it felt like the room itself had shifted in response. This was no longer just a game of legal minds, this had become personal. He held her gaze for a moment too long, his fingers gripping the pencil tighter before, almost imperceptibly, they loosened, and a slow exhale escaped his lips. It was a subtle but necessary release, the kind that signified the first crack in the armor he had so carefully crafted over the years. With the grace of a man who had perfected the art of masking his emotions, Barnaby Green straightened, forcing his face back into the impassive mask of the impartial juror, calm, collected, in control. But Miss Marple had seen enough. Her sharp eyes, ever observant, caught the fleeting shift, the tension that broke for just a fraction of a second. She offered a soft smile, a silent acknowledgement that the game had changed. Barnaby had spent years orchestrating his revenge, manipulating those around him to secure the downfall of the Harding family. Yet, there was one thing he hadn't accounted for, a sharp-eyed woman who had spent a lifetime watching the patterns of men like him. She had seen him slip, just once, and that was all she needed. As the trial continued, the air in the courtroom had shifted. The revelation of Ronald Harding's letter rippled through the proceedings, unsettling the neatly arranged accusations that had previously pointed squarely at Harriet Finch. The tension was palpable, but Miss Marple knew that a shift in the wind wasn't enough to change the course of the trial. It needed to be a storm, one that would sweep through and expose the truth. She was more than prepared to summon it. The judge called for a recess, and the murmur of voices swelled like the calm before the storm. Reporters clustered together, whispering in animated conversations, while the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple, however, did not hesitate. Rising gracefully from her seat, she moved through the crowd with a purpose that made it clear she knew exactly where she was going. She made her way toward Mr. Petton, the defense barrister, who had just been helping himself to a biscuit soaked in brandy. He barely had time to swallow before he found himself face to face with the formidable presence of Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, dabbing at his lips with a napkin, his voice smooth but hesitant. "I must say this morning's proceedings have no time for pleasantries, Mr. Petton," Miss Marple interjected, her tone gentle but carrying an undeniable authority. "I have something of the utmost importance to share, and I'm afraid we don't have much time." Petton, well aware of the urgency that accompanied a determined woman, gestured for her to follow him into a quiet corner of the courthouse's law library. The room smelled of old parchment, polished oak, and the ink of countless legal volumes. Shelves of musty case files stood like silent sentinels, bearing witness to the intrigue unfolding before them. Once they were alone, Miss Marple unfolded the matter at hand with the calm precision of a woman who had spent her life unraveling mysteries. "I am certain," she began, her voice steady and sure, "that Barnaby Green has been deliberately shaping the outcome of this trial." Petton's brow furrowed, his interest piqued. "The juror," Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp. "Not just any juror, Mr. Petton. A man with a personal vendetta against the Harding family." She reached into her handbag, producing a small collection of papers, documents she had painstakingly gathered with the help of Miss Cartwright, the eager librarian from the village archives. "These," Miss Marple continued, passing the files to Petton, "detail a land dispute from 30 years ago, one in which Barnaby Green's family lost everything to Sir Charles Harding, Ronald Harding's father." Petton's expression darkened as he scanned the papers. Miss Marple pressed on. "Barnaby disappeared after the ruling, did he not, left St. Mary Meal altogether, and yet he returned precisely in time to sit on the jury of a Harding murder trial." Petton's brows furrowed deeper. "You suspect." "I suspect," Miss Marple said with quiet but undeniable certainty, "that Barnaby Green has not only ensured Harriet Finch's conviction, but that he may very well have had a hand in the crime itself." Petton ran a hand over his chin, his mind racing as he absorbed the weight of her words. If what she was suggesting was true, it would change everything. "And if this is true?" he asked, his voice low. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "It is," she replied simply. The gravity of her statement settled over them both. Petton exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking between the documents and Miss Marple's unwavering certainty. Then, with a decisive nod, he turned and strode toward the door. "I'm going to request an emergency conference with the judge," he declared. When they returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Petton, usually one for dramatic flourishes, moved with unusual urgency. His briefcase was in hand, his steps purposeful and unhesitating as he made his way toward the judge's bench. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, sensing the shift in the air. "My lord," Petton said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "the defense requests an emergency conference with your honor." A hush fell over the spectators, the judge's gavel struck with a resounding crack, and all eyes turned toward him as he adjusted his spectacles and regarded the defense barrister with an unwavering, piercing gaze. "On what grounds?" The judge's voice was sharp, cutting through the thick tension in the room. Petton exchanged a brief glance with Miss Marple before turning back to face the bench. "On the grounds," he said smoothly, his tone betraying nothing of the storm raging beneath the surface, "that this case has been compromised at the highest level." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment stunned silence gripped the room. Barnaby Green, seated motionless in the jury box, slowly placed his pencil down, the small movement almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple noticed. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The game had changed, and at last the truth was starting to unravel. The judge's chambers, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the courtroom, were small, intimate, and lined with dark mahogany bookshelves filled with aging legal tomes. The lingering scent of pipe tobacco mixed with the faint odor of ink and parchment. A single desk lamp flickered weakly, casting long shadows against the oak-paneled walls. This was a room made for reflection, for deliberation, a space where decisions were reached in quiet, decisive moments. Today it would be the stage for a reckoning. At the long table sat four figures of importance, the judge, his expression unreadable, fingers lightly steepled as he listened; Julian Graves, the prosecuting barrister, his usual composure now threadbare as he sensed the ground shifting beneath him; Mr. Petton, unruffled, his legal brief resting before him with an air of quiet confidence; and Barnaby Green, who sat in the corner, his face carefully composed, though not enough to hide the tightness in his jaw. Miss Marple, the very picture of mild English civility, sat patiently, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for the judge to speak. When he did, his voice was steady, measured, and firm. "Mr. Petton has made a serious accusation regarding the integrity of this jury," the judge said, his eyes flicking from Petton to Green. "He claims, Miss Marple, that you have brought forward evidence to support such a claim." Miss Marple smiled gently, a serene expression that carried the weight of certainty. "Indeed, my lord, I would be most happy to explain." With careful precision, she reached into her handbag and withdrew a series of neatly folded newspaper clippings. She laid them before the judge, each one marked with the weight of years. "These, my lord," she said, her voice light as though recounting a simple anecdote, "are reports from 30 years ago." She paused, watching the room, feeling the tension build as she spoke. "They detail a lawsuit between Sir Charles Harding, the father of the deceased, and a certain Edwin Green." A faint rustle of interest passed through the room, and Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly to Barnaby, noting the almost imperceptible twitch of his fingers. Ah, there it was, the subtle sign of discomfort. She continued smoothly. The case was a bitter one, as Edwin Green, a tenant farmer, claimed he had been promised the land he had worked for decades. Sir Charles, however, had other ideas. She tapped the clipping before her. The ruling was of course in favor of Sir Charles, and the Greens lost everything. The judge leaned forward slightly, scanning the documents with a practiced eye. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly on the table, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Barnaby Green, the young son of Edwin Green, left St. Mary Meal shortly after the case was lost. She turned her gaze toward Barnaby. "That is correct, isn't it, Mr. Green?" Barnaby did not respond immediately. His jaw was set, his expression controlled, but Miss Marple could see the fatigue in his eyes. After a long pause, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That is correct," he admitted, his voice tight. Julian Graves, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "Even if this is true," he said smoothly, "it hardly constitutes proof of jury tampering." Miss Marple's expression shifted to one of mild amusement. "Oh, but my dear Mr. Graves," she said softly, her tone deceptively gentle, "I am afraid it constitutes rather a great deal." She glanced toward the judge. "You see, my lord, I have been watching the jury very carefully," she continued, turning her attention back to Barnaby. "And Mr. Green, in particular." Her voice remained light, almost conversational, but the words cut through the silence with the precision of a needlepoint. "I noticed something quite interesting," she said, "whenever a key piece of evidence was presented, evidence that the prosecution needed to secure a conviction. Mr. Green would murmur." There was a shift in the room. The judge's brow furrowed. "Murmur?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Yes," Miss Marple said lightly, her eyes never leaving Barnaby's face. A low remark, just loud enough for the jurors near him to hear, a well-timed comment to reinforce the prosecution's theory, to nudge the impartial jurors toward the inevitable conclusion. Petton, ever perceptive, leaned forward, his interest piqued, as Miss Marple's words echoed through the chamber. The room was heavy with anticipation, and the pieces were falling into place. "Did you notice, Miss Marple, whether these comments were always aimed in one direction?" The judge's voice cut through the growing tension, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to reach into her very thoughts. Miss Marple, ever the picture of calm, inclined her head ever so slightly. "Oh, indeed, my lord," she replied, her voice soft but laced with purpose. "They were always designed to tilt the jury's sympathies, specifically against Mr. Harriet Finch." A heavy silence followed, thick with the weight of implication. For the first time, Barnaby Green shifted slightly in his chair, his composed facade cracking just enough for Miss Marple to notice. The judge's eyes narrowed, as he regarded Green with a newfound scrutiny. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Green," he said, his voice laced with both authority and suspicion. "Do you deny them?" Barnaby, without missing a beat, smoothed the cuffs of his crisp shirt, his demeanor returning to the cool restraint of a man who had long been accustomed to power. "I do not deny," he said, evenly, his voice calm but with an edge, "that I hold no great love for the Hardings." He paused, his gaze shifting toward Miss Marple. The unreadable expression in his eyes did not waver, but the tension was palpable. "But that," he continued, his voice firm, "is hardly the same as manipulating a verdict." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, yet the weight of her words was undeniable. "Oh, my dear sir," she said, her tone now touched with genuine amusement, "but you didn't merely influence the jury, did you? You very nearly ensured a wrongful conviction." She let the words hang in the air, allowing them to settle like dust in the room, before adding, almost as an afterthought, "And I very much suspect you know who actually killed Ronald Harding." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air thickening with a sharp, unnatural silence. For the first time, Barnaby Green's control slipped entirely. His hand clenched into a fist, and his mouth pressed into a thin line. He opened it, as if to speak, but the words seemed to have abandoned him. Miss Marple, still so mild, so unassuming, knew that the collapse of the prosecution was imminent. The judge turned his attention to Julian Graves, who now looked distinctly paler than he had moments before. "Graves," the judge said, his voice heavy with meaning, "I do believe the integrity of this case has been compromised." Graves hesitated, his face betraying the weight of the situation. "My lord," he began, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him with a single authoritative gesture. "This trial cannot proceed under these circumstances," the judge declared, his words final. "I will be calling for an immediate investigation into Mr. Green's conduct. Until then, this case is to be halted." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Barnaby Green, who had not spoken, sat perfectly still, his face a mask of composure, but the tension in his eyes told a different story. As the meeting was dismissed, Petton turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mixture of admiration and fascination. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, tucking his briefcase under his arm, "you have done what no barrister could, you've collapsed the entire prosecution." Miss Marple smiled gently, her calm exterior betraying no hint of pride. "Oh, I wouldn't say that," she replied, smoothing the cuffs of her sleeves. "I merely pointed out what was always there." Her gaze flickered back toward Barnaby Green, who was now staring out of the window, his hands clasped tightly together, the subtle tremor in his fingers betraying the turmoil within. Miss Marple's expression turned thoughtful. Barnaby was hiding something, something more, and before this was over she would uncover it. The air in the courtroom felt different when they returned. The grandeur of the mahogany walls, and the soaring vaulted ceiling which had once lent an air of dignity to the proceedings, now seemed stifling. It was as if the very walls recoiled at the unraveling of justice that had taken place within them. The usual murmur of anticipation had shifted in tone. It was no longer the excited whispers of spectators eagerly awaiting a dramatic verdict, but rather the hushed, nervous tension of a room that had just realized it had been deceived. The judge sat grim-faced at his bench, hands steepled, his expression a mixture of barely contained fury and reluctant duty. "Before we proceed further," the judge's voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the stillness like a whip. "This court must acknowledge a grave matter that has come to light." A hush fell over the room, the weight of his words sinking in. "I have been made aware of serious allegations concerning one of the jurors, allegations that compromise the integrity of this trial." He turned his gaze toward the jury box, where the assembled jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, their faces ranging from confusion to alarm. "All members of the jury are hereby dismissed, pending a formal inquiry," the judge announced. "This trial cannot in good conscience proceed under these circumstances." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Barnaby Green, still seated in the jury box, remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed ahead, his hands clasped tightly together, as if holding himself together. "Green," the judge said, turning to face him, his voice now cold and measured, "would you care to explain yourself?" Barnaby, to his credit, did not flinch. He met the judge's gaze head-on, his expression carefully neutral. "I am uncertain what exactly I am accused of, my lord," he said, his voice calm, though there was a slight tremor in it. "If it is a crime to hold an opinion on a case, then I fear many jurors would be guilty." The judge's expression darkened. "It is not your opinions that trouble me, Mr. Green," he said, his voice low with growing intensity. "It is the evidence that you sought." The murmurs rippled through the remaining members of the jury, several of them casting uneasy glances at Barnaby, as though the full weight of his manipulation was only now beginning to settle into their minds. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the gallery, observed the scene with a sharp, calculating eye. She had long known that men like Barnaby Green were not the type to confess their wrongdoings outright. They concealed their sins beneath layers of calculated composure, only unraveling when the right pressure was applied. and the judge, it seemed, had every intention of applying just that pressure. "You failed to disclose your long-standing enmity with the Harding family." The judge's voice was cold, his words slicing through the room with surgical precision. "You positioned yourself on this jury, knowing full well you could not act as an impartial juror. And beyond that, Mr. Green, you deliberately swayed your fellow jurors into believing your narrative." Barnaby's fingers tightened subtly against the polished wood railing, his face betraying none of the internal storm raging within. A long tense silence stretched between them before Barnaby let out a slow measured breath. The carefully constructed facade of control, which had defined his every action in this trial, seemed to fray at the edges, his shoulders stiffening, his jaw tightening. For the first time, Barnaby Green looked less like a man of measured reason, and more like someone whose carefully laid plans were beginning to crumble. "I did what was necessary," he said, at last, his voice low, but carrying the resonance of old anger. A murmur of unease swept through the spectators, but Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet triumph. She had always known this moment would come. The judge's expression remained unwavering. "Necessary," he repeated, his voice dangerously controlled. Barnaby exhaled sharply, as though the weight of years of pent-up resentment had finally found its release. "I grew up watching my father lose everything," he said, bitterly. "Everything because of a Harding, their greed, their power. Do you have any idea what that does to a man, my lord? To a boy who watches his family cast out, humiliated?" He gave a harsh, mirthless laugh. "I saw an opportunity," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I took it. I sat on this jury because it was my chance to right a wrong that had never been accounted for, to make a Harding pay." A heavy silence fell, his words hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The judge's gaze never wavered. "Then you are aware, of course," he said, his tone cold as steel, "that this trial was not about Sir Charles Harding's sins. It was about whether or not Harriet Finch was guilty of murder." Barnaby's mouth pressed into a thin line, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. And yet the judge continued, his voice low and deadly, "You were so blinded by vengeance that you were willing to see an innocent woman hanged for a crime she did not commit." Barnaby said nothing in response, because in truth there was nothing left for him to say. The judge turned to the bailiff, his voice firm, unwavering. "Mr. Green is to be taken into custody for further questioning." A sharp gasp rang through the gallery, followed by a flurry of whispers, but Barnaby did not struggle, he did not protest. He merely stood, his face blank as if the weight of his entire life had unraveled before him. Without a word he allowed himself to be led away. Miss Marple, watching silently, felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only certainty. The jury had been dismissed, the trial was in ruins, but still something gnawed at her, something that didn't sit right. Barnaby Green, for all his guilt, had not murdered Ronald Harding. And if he hadn't, then who had? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes narrowing with thought. It was time to uncover the true killer. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. Where once there had been an air of inevitability, the sense of the trial drawing toward its expected conclusion, now there was only uncertainty. The judge's expression, still as imperious as ever, now bore the weight of reluctance, wariness, and barely concealed outrage. The weight of his robe seemed heavier as he leaned slightly forward, clearing his throat before delivering the words that would change everything. "This court finds," the judge's voice rang out, like a gavel striking stone, "that due to jury misconduct, the integrity of this trial has been irreparably compromised." A stunned silence followed. Then, like a breaking wave, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Journalists scribbled furiously, voices rose in confusion, and Harriet Finch, who had spent the past weeks trapped in a waking nightmare, collapsed into quiet, broken sobs. Miss Agatha Marple, seated serenely in the gallery, did not move. She did not flinch as the noise swirled around her. She had seen this moment coming long before anyone else, but that did not mean her work was finished. not yet. Harriet Finch may have been freed from the immediate danger, but the true killer was still out there, and Miss Marple had every intention of finding them. Harriet had not truly won her freedom, not entirely. The trial had collapsed, Barnaby Green had been removed in disgrace, and his obsessive manipulation had been exposed for all to see, but the court had not ruled on her innocence. It had only declared that the case could not proceed in its current form. The question of who truly killed Ronald Harding still loomed unanswered, and until it was resolved, Harriet was left suspended in a state of uncertainty, caught between guilt and innocence, her fate hanging by a thread. She turned toward Mr. Pemberton, her lawyer, her tear-streaked face betraying her desperation for clarity. "What does this mean?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Am I free, Mr. Pemberton, usually the epitome of composure, looked gravely at her, his features more drawn than she'd ever seen them. "For now," he said quietly, "but the prosecution may still push for a retrial." Harriet's heart sank as her breath caught in her throat. The possibility of reliving it all, the accusations, the whispers, the unrelenting shift of public opinion against her, was almost too much to bear. Miss Marple, observing the quiet despair that clung to Harriet, made a mental note: this could not be allowed to happen. She adjusted her gloves with a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the anxiety gripping the courtroom. This case was far from over. Across the room, Julian Graves, the prosecuting barrister, sat hunched over, his once steely confidence now reduced to a nervous tension. His key juror, Barnaby Green, had been exposed as biased, and his strongest arguments, that Harriet had the motive, means and opportunity, now lay in tatters. The last-minute change to Ronald Harding's will had cast doubt on everything, making the prosecution's case weaker than ever. The public, no longer swayed by the prosecution's narrative, had turned away from their once strong support. Miss Marple watched as Graves absently rubbed his temple, his frustration evident. If they attempted a retrial, they would need fresh evidence, something solid enough to survive the intense scrutiny it would undoubtedly face. Miss Marple was certain, however, that they had nothing left to offer. From the moment Barnaby Green was escorted from the courtroom, the very foundation of the prosecution's case had crumbled. Yet, someone had still killed Ronald Harding, and until that person was found, Harriet would never truly be free. The judge's gavel struck the wood one last time, bringing a semblance of order to the chaos that had erupted around them. "This court is adjourned," he intoned, his voice cutting through the noise. "Further proceedings will be determined at a later date." Harriet exhaled sharply, a complex mix of relief and dread filling her chest. But Miss Marple, ever the strategist, had already decided what needed to be done. She would not allow another trial to drag on, another round of suspicions and accusations to keep Harriet trapped in this nightmare. Before the prosecution had a chance to rebuild their case, before Harriet Finch could spend another day in the shadow of suspicion, Miss Marple would unearth the true murderer. She already had a very good idea of where to start. Rising from her seat with deliberate grace, Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her movements precise, almost mechanical in their calmness. It was time for the real mystery to be solved. The village of St. Mary Me, usually a quiet and unassuming place, had become the epicenter of gossip and speculation. That morning, however, it was abuzz with the latest developments. The scandal of Harriet Finch, the disgrace of Barnaby Green, and the lingering question of who had truly killed Ronald Harding were the only topics of conversation. At the bakery, at the post office, and even at Mrs. Potts' tea shop, the women whispered over their cups, speculating, judging and dissecting every detail. Miss Marple, however, paid little attention to the idle chatter that filled the air. She had long known that public opinion was loud but ultimately unreliable. It was the quiet, methodical work behind the scenes that would uncover the truth. The crisp autumn air greeted her as she stepped into the modest police station nestled in the heart of the village. Inside, Inspector Henry Graves, a stocky man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was rifling through a pile of files, his pipe cold and forgotten on the desk. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a weary sigh, rubbing his temple as though the weight of the case had settled heavily on him. "I suppose you've come to tell me something I should have figured out myself." Miss Marple offered a polite smile, settling into the chair opposite him. "Oh, Inspector," she said softly, her voice laced with gentle humor, "I would never dream of it. But it did occur to me that in all the excitement over Mr. Green's tampering, we may have overlooked something rather important." Graves gave her a wary look, clearly not in the mood for any more cryptic remarks. "And what's that?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "The actual murderer of Ronald Harding," Miss Marple replied calmly, her eyes never leaving his. The room hit him into a heavy silence, the only sound the persistent ticking of the wall clock. Graves leaned back in his chair, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Go on then," he muttered, clearly not expecting much. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her gaze steady. "Tell me, Inspector," she said, her tone thoughtful, "have you taken a proper look at Ronald Harding's personal files?" She leaned slightly forward, not just the ones related to the trial, but his full personal history. Inspector Graves was still trying to piece together the puzzle of Ronald Harding's death when Miss Marple interrupted his thoughts. "You've overlooked something crucial, Inspector," she began, her voice soft but insistent. "It's not just the relationship between Harding and Harriet that we need to examine, but Harding's business dealings." Graves raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss her outright. Instead, he sifted through the pile of papers on his desk and pulled out a folder marked Private R. Harding. He flipped it open, scanning the documents before freezing. "What is it?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze steady as she waited for him to speak. Graves cursed under his breath, muttering as he read aloud, "Diaries, letters, mentions of a Mr. Alderton, a business partner. There was a quarrel over land. Harding accused him of fraud, but instead of reporting it, he tried to negotiate a settlement." Miss Marple nodded, knowingly. "Of course Harding had his own skeletons to hide," she said calmly, watching Graves' growing realization. "But this isn't a crime of passion, Inspector. This was a calculated murder, poisoning delivered in the most discreet way possible, at just the right moment. Someone who needed Harding dead, but without causing a scandal." Graves' eyes widened as he grasped the magnitude of her words. "All this time we've been chasing the wrong person, focusing on Harriet Finch," he muttered, clearly frustrated by the oversight. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "The best lies, Inspector, are always the ones that are the most believable. It makes sense, doesn't it? A woman stands to lose an inheritance, and naturally, she becomes the prime suspect." Graves clenched his jaw, the weight of the case pressing down on him. Barnaby Green. He was so sure of Harriet's guilt, but he never considered that she might not be the killer. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Which means, Inspector, that we must now turn our attention to Mr. Alderton. We need to find out where he was on the night Ronald Harding was poisoned." Graves exhaled sharply, already rising to grab his coat. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he muttered under his breath. "I don't know whether to be grateful or irritated." Miss Marple patted her handbag with an air of quiet satisfaction. "Oh, Inspector, I should think you'd be used to it by now." With that she rose from her seat, already certain that Alderton's past was about to catch up with him. The streets of St. Mary Me had been buzzing with gossip since the trial, but the quietest place in the village that morning was the modest office of Inspector Graves. Within its wood-paneled walls, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Miss Marple, seated in her usual unassuming manner, folded her hands neatly in her lap as she observed Graves, who had been uncharacteristically silent ever since receiving the forensic report from Scotland Yard. For once Miss Marple allowed him the space to process it on his own. Finally, with a sharp exhale, Graves tossed the papers onto his desk. "The poison," he grumbled, "it wasn't from Harriet Finch's shed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Well, of course it wasn't," she replied with calm certainty. Graves shot her a look of mild exasperation, but there was a trace of admiration in his expression. "The lab confirmed it," he said, tapping the report for emphasis. "The poison in Harding's teacup, a rare alkaloid-based compound, was traced back to a warehouse owned by none other than Mr. Alderton." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts already in motion. "A businessman, a fraudster, and now it seems a murderer," she mused. Graves ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "All this time we were chasing the wrong angle. Harriet's connection to Barnaby Green, the inheritance, all of it. It was all a distraction." Miss Marple's voice was laced with amusement as she responded. "Surely by now, Inspector, you realize that the best misdirection isn't an obvious lie, but rather an elegant half-truth." By late afternoon, Mr. Alderton, a man who had skillfully avoided scandal despite his many questionable dealings, was summoned to the station under the guise of routine questioning. He arrived with an air of self-assurance, his cane tapping lightly against the floor as he was led to the interrogation room. His expression was one of vague irritation, as though this inconvenience were beneath him. But when Inspector Graves placed the forensic report before him, Alderton's composure faltered for the first time. He looked down at the report, his face draining of color. Graves leaned forward, his tone hardening as he spoke. "Mr. Alderton, we know what you've been hiding, now you'll tell us everything." The tension in the room was palpable as Inspector Graves leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Mr. Alderton. "Funny, isn't it?" he mused, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. "You were meticulous, almost too meticulous. Had you been just a little less thorough, we might never have suspected you, but you made one fatal mistake." Alderton's fingers curled tightly around the armrests of his chair, his jaw tightening with barely suppressed fury. Graves continued, his voice smooth, almost casual, but with an undercurrent of menace. "You assumed no one would test for traces of poison anywhere other than Harriet Finch's property. And yet, here we are." Alderton's silence spoke volumes, but Graves pressed on. He lifted the forensic report, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Unfortunately for you, Mr. Alderton, the very same compound found in Harding's teacup was traced back to your warehouse." A flicker of unease crossed Alderton's face, but only for a second. Miss Marple, who had been watching intently from her corner, noticed it instantly. Graves wasn't done. "Do you know what else we found?" he asked, his voice sharp with anticipation. Alderton's eyes betrayed a flicker of panic, but he quickly masked it. Graves slammed an invoice onto the table, for a shipment of this very poison, signed and dated 1 week before Harding's murder. The room fell into a tense silence before Alderton's laugh cut through the air. It was not the laugh of an innocent man, but of one who had already accepted defeat. "I suppose there's no point in denying it now, is there?" he said, adjusting his cuffs with exaggerated nonchalance. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "No, my dear sir, I rather think there isn't." Alderton exhaled sharply, his facade cracking as he finally gave in. "Fine," he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "Yes, I killed Harding. The man was a fool. He had no business meddling in my affairs." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her voice almost a whisper as she interjected. "By which you mean your fraudulent land scheme." Alderton's eyes narrowed, but he didn't deny it. "That idiot threatened to expose me," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Harding thought he could blackmail me, get me to pay him off to keep quiet. But he didn't realize that the land deal he was tangled in would implicate him too. So I decided to solve the problem permanently." Graves let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. "And to cover your tracks you framed Harriet Finch." Alderton merely shrugged, his tone dismissive. "A woman scorned over a will. It was the most obvious motive. The poison in her shed, it was too perfect a scenario to resist." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice tinged with quiet disappointment. "Yes, well, the problem with perfect crimes, Mr. Alderton, is that they are rarely as flawless as one hopes." By the time the clock struck an hour, Alderton was formally arrested, his fraudulent dealings, financial threats, and now a charge of premeditated murder making headlines across the village. The following morning, the newspapers blared with the sensational news: Alderton confesses to murder in land fraud scheme, defendant exonerated. Miss Marple, however, did not bask in the village's newfound admiration. Instead, she made her way to Harriet Finch's cottage. Harriet, now officially exonerated, sat by the window, her gaze lost in the rose garden that had once been hers before. Scandal had turned her life upside down. When she saw Miss Marple approaching, she rose at once, her eyes flickering with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say." Miss Marple smiled warmly, setting down a parcel of biscuits she had brought. "Well, my dear, you might begin with a cup of tea," she suggested gently. "I find that after such matters are put to rest, tea is most necessary." Harriet, still slightly trembling, let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "Yes," she murmured, her voice steadier now, "I think I rather agree." Later that evening, as Miss Marple made her way home, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had seen many crimes in her lifetime, misguided men led astray by greed, vengeance, and desperation, but the worst, she always thought, were those who assumed that justice could be bent, hidden, or bought. Because in the end justice always found a way, and when necessary, a certain elderly lady with a sharp mind and a keen eye would help it along. With a satisfied sigh, Miss Marple settled into her chair, knitting needles in hand, a serene smile playing on her lips. All was well for now. The morning light broke over St. Mary Me with an uncommon brilliance, as though the village itself had decided to shake off the gloom of scandal and return to its usual calm. At the post office, newspapers were snatched up eagerly, their headlines blazing in bold black ink. "Poison plot thwarted, defendant exonerated, Alderton confesses to murder in land fraud scheme." Miss Marple, having long since read the news over her morning tea, walked with quiet satisfaction toward Harriet's cottage. There were few moments in life as gratifying as seeing justice not only served but seen to be served. And this morning, Harriet Finch was free. When Miss Marple arrived, she found Harriet by the window, the morning newspaper folded in her lap, her hands still trembling slightly from the sheer weight of it all. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her eyes red-rimmed but bright with relief. As Harriet Finch gazed at Miss Marple, a heavy sense of relief washed over her, her voice trembling as she whispered, "It's truly over, isn't it?" Miss Marple, ever composed, placed the warm parcel of scones on the table beside her and took a sip. "Yes, my dear," she replied, with the calm assurance of someone who had long since untangled the knottiest of mysteries. "No new trials, no more whispers in hushed corners. The Crown has officially withdrawn all charges." Harriet's breath came out in a shaky exhale, the weight of fear and uncertainty. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice breaking on the words. "If it weren't for you I might have—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the terror still too fresh in her mind. Miss Marple patted her hand gently, her eyes warm but knowing. "My dear, I've always believed that truth has a way of surfacing, even if it needs a little assistance now and then." A tearful laugh bubbled from Harriet's throat, and to Miss Marple's mild surprise, the woman threw her arms around her in an embrace, a gesture of gratitude and raw emotion. Though Miss Marple was not accustomed to such displays, she gave Harriet a reassuring pat, then gently extracted herself with as much dignity as one could muster in such an unexpected moment. Now," she said, clearing her throat with her usual mild manner. "No need for all that." Harriet wiped her eyes, laughing through her tears. "I suppose you'll say there's nothing remarkable about what you did," she teased. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes twinkling with a glimmer of amusement. "Oh, I should never say that, my dear," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "But I have always believed that a good mystery, like a good knitting pattern, requires patience, attention to detail, and just the right number of twists." Outside the cottage, the village of St. Mary Mead was slowly returning to its normal rhythm. The usual gossips in the tea shop were now debating whether it was more shocking that Harriet had been accused at all, or that she had been so spectacularly exonerated. At the post office, Mrs. Ebb, once Harriet's fiercest critic, was loudly proclaiming her unwavering belief that Harriet had never been guilty. Even at the baker's shop, the conversation had shifted from scandal to the latest gossip, the butcher's wife running off with a traveling salesman. Life, as always, moved on. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Harriet caught her hand once more, her gratitude overflowing. "I'll never be able to thank you properly," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Miss Marple adjusted her sensible hat, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Well, my dear," she said with a smile, "a nice tea cake from time to time never goes amiss." With that, Miss Marple stepped out into the warm sunlight, her heart content, knowing that for now all was well. As she walked home, the village around her buzzed with life again, people murmuring about the trial, Aleron's treachery, and how nothing would ever quite be the same again. But Miss Marple knew better. Villages heal, scandals fade, and somewhere, someday, another mystery would surely arise. She only hoped it would wait long enough for her to finish her tea. The grounds of the Finch estate looked more enchanting than ever under a sky dappled with golden paper lanterns in pink, blue and pale gold. A brass band played the latest jazz numbers, the saxophone's lively wail filling the warm evening air. Ladies in sparkling flapper gowns twirled gracefully in the arms of well-dressed gentlemen, their laughter ringing bright as champagne bubbles. The scandal of the past weeks had finally been set aside, and tonight, St. Mary Mead was ready to do what it did best, celebrate the resolution of a great mystery, as if nothing had ever happened. At the center of it all stood Harriet, radiant in an emerald gown, her hair elegantly pinned back in waves. She was free, truly free, and as she accepted congratulatory hugs, she knew there was one person she had to thank above all others. Miss Agatha Marple sat quietly at the edge of the party, her gloved hands folded over her handbag, content to observe. A small plate of lemon sponge cake beside her indicated that she had, in fact, been properly bribed into attendance. Harriet approached, holding a flute of champagne, a warm smile on her lips. "Miss Marple," she said, "I do hope you're enjoying yourself." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes twinkling with a touch of mischief. "My dear, I shall enjoy myself far more, once I confirm that no further murders are planned for the..." Harriet laughed, her voice light and relieved. "Oh, I think we've had quite enough of that, don't you?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, ever the model of decorum. "One can only hope, my dear, but people do have a way of getting themselves into mischief when least expected." Harriet sat beside her, growing thoughtful. "Do you know," she said after a moment, "I've been wondering. How is it that you always seem to know exactly how to unravel these mysteries?" As Harriet Finch stood amidst the gathering, her gaze locked on Miss Marple, a flicker of recognition passed between them, one that spoke volumes of the unspoken bond they had formed over the past weeks. "It's truly over, isn't it?" Harriet murmured, her voice a soft breath of relief. Miss Marple, ever the picture of composure, set down the basket of freshly baked scones and settled into her chair. "Yes, my dear," she replied, her voice carrying a weight of finality, soothed Harriet's frayed nerves. "No more trials, no more whispers in the corners of the courtroom. Everything has been cleared." Harriet exhaled, the tension that had bound her for so long melting away. "You saved me," she whispered, her words a vulnerable confession. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to me." She couldn't bring herself to finish, the thought too horrifying. Miss Marple's hand, warm and steady, covered hers, her expression gentle but knowing. "Truth has a way of finding its way to the surface," she said with quiet conviction, "even if it requires a little nudge from time to time." Harriet chuckled through her tears, her relief palpable, and in an impulsive surge of emotion, she threw her arms around Miss Marple, pulling her into a tight embrace. Miss Marple, unaccustomed to such displays, patted Harriet's back with all the dignity she could muster before gently disentangling herself. Now, she said with a wry smile, her tone never losing its calm. There's no need for such theatrics. Harriet wiped her eyes, letting out a soft laugh. I suppose you'll claim there's nothing extraordinary about what you did, she teased, her voice light, though the depth of her gratitude was unmistakable. Miss Marple's lips curved ever so slightly, her eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and wisdom. Oh, I would never say that, she replied. But a good mystery, like a good knitting pattern, requires patience, attention to detail, and just the right amount of twists. The village outside, having heard the verdict, was already returning to its regular rhythm. In the tea shop, the usual gossips debated whether it was more shocking that Harriet had been accused in the first place, or that she had been so dramatically cleared of all charges. Mrs. Barn, who had once been Harriet's harshest critic, was loudly proclaiming to anyone who would listen that she had never believed the accusations, while at the post office, the baker's wife was already planning the next scandal about the butcher's wife and a traveling salesman. It was as though nothing had ever happened, and life was already resuming its familiar pace. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Harriet caught her hand once more, her voice thick with emotion. I will never be able to thank you properly, she said, her gratitude overwhelming her words. Miss Marple, adjusting her sensible hat with an air of quiet satisfaction, replied with her trademark simplicity. Well, my dear, she said, a nice tea cake once in a while never goes amiss. And with that, she stepped into the sunshine, her heart light and content, knowing that for now at least, everything was as it should be. The village, bustling with life around her, had already moved on, whispers of the trial fading into the past, replaced with the hum of the present. Yet, Miss Marple knew that life was ever unpredictable, and the quiet pulse of mystery would surely rise again, though she hoped it would hold off long enough for her to finish her tea. At the Finch estate, the garden party reached its zenith under the glow of golden lanterns, the warm evening breeze gently swaying them as the band played a lively waltz. Guests, once mired in gossip and scandal, now danced with abandon, their laughter filling the air like champagne bubbles. Harriet, now fully free from the shadow of suspicion, stood in the center, resplendent in a deep emerald gown, her hair pinned back in elegant waves. She had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, and now it was her turn to show gratitude. She raised her champagne flute, the soft chime of silver on crystal, bringing silence to the crowd. My dear friends, Harriet began, her voice carrying across the gathering, I stand here humbled beyond words by the kindness and support I've received. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a few guilty expressions fleetingly crossing the faces of those who had once whispered otherwise. It wasn't long ago that I stood accused of a crime I did not commit, she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion welling inside. But as you all know, the truth has a way of coming to light, even in the darkest of times. She turned toward Miss Marple, who sat serenely on the edge of the gathering, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And for that, I owe everything to Miss Agatha Marple. A round of applause broke out, but Miss Marple, ever humble, merely inclined her head in acknowledgement. Harriet's smile deepened as she continued. In these past weeks, I have learned that justice is not merely about evidence or argument, but about the keen eye of someone who understands human nature. Miss Marple's lips twitched, a sly glimmer in her eye. Oh my dear, I should say that human nature does all the work for me, she said with a teasing smile. I simply pay attention. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the tension that had once gripped the village now dissipating. Harriet then turned to Mr. Pluton, who was standing near the champagne fountain, ever the showman, ever the legal defender. And I must also thank Mr. Pluton, Harriet continued, raising her glass in his direction, who defended me when no one else would. Mr. Pluton, with a flourish, bowed slightly, his voice smooth as ever. My dear Miss Finch, he said, I am simply glad that I was able to do my job without fainting in the process. The crowd erupted in laughter, and for the first time in weeks, the village was filled with joy and lightness. But Harriet's expression softened as she raised her glass for a final toast. "There is one more thing I must say," she continued, her voice growing quieter. "While my cousin Ronald, Harriet Finch, stood with poised grace atop the small garden platform, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her champagne flute, which caught the dimming light of the evening sun. The soft rustling of the leaves above, and the gentle strains of jazz from the brass band in the distance, created an atmosphere that, though celebratory, felt like a turning point, an unwritten chapter now etched into the village's history. Her voice, when it finally rose above the gathering hum, was steady and clear, carrying the weight of both gratitude and newfound resolve. "It is said that a person's true character is revealed not in times of prosperity, but in moments of crisis," she began, the crowd going quiet, all eyes upon her. "Not so long ago, I stood before you, accused of a crime I did not commit, trapped within a web of suspicion and judgment. Yet today, I stand here not as a woman defeated, but as one who has learned the true meaning of justice." There was a subtle ripple through the crowd, a wave of understanding that passed from person to person. Some who had once whispered in hushed tones now bowed their heads in acknowledgement, perhaps realizing how quickly they had allowed their fears to shape their opinions. But Harriet continued, her smile growing, eyes bright with quiet triumph. "Justice, my friends, is not solely about evidence or facts laid out in a courtroom. It is about something deeper, an understanding of human nature, the quiet observation of the way people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. It is the keen eye of someone who sees beyond the facades we so carefully construct." As she spoke, her gaze shifted to where Miss Marple sat, the woman who had quietly, almost imperceptibly, unraveled the knots of suspicion that had once held Harriet's life in place. Miss Marple's expression remained as composed as ever, but there was a flicker of something pride perhaps beneath the surface. "And it is to Miss Agatha Marple, whose unparalleled understanding of people's hearts and minds guided us all through the storm, that I owe everything. Without her, I would not be here today, standing in front of you, as a free woman." The applause came in waves, a sound that once might have seemed hollow, now felt genuine, sincere. Miss Marple, ever the modest observer, gave a small nod, acknowledging the gratitude without allowing herself to be swept away by it. Harriet paused, allowing the applause to die down before continuing. She raised her glass higher, the delicate crystal catching the last rays of the sun, as the crowd held its breath, anticipating her next words. "And in the spirit of justice, I have decided to do something in honor of my late cousin Ronald. Though our relationship was complicated, and his choices were questionable, his final letter expressed a desire to make amends, to rebuild what had been broken." Her voice softened, a touch of melancholy creeping in. "And so I have decided to donate the land he left me to the village, not to build a monument to his memory, but to create something that will outlast all of us, a community orchard, a place where we can gather, plant and grow side by side, not in the shadows of old grievances, but in the light of something new." The crowd's reaction was swift, gasps of surprise followed by a deep collective murmur of approval. Harriet's words had struck a chord, and the applause that followed was thunderous, a sound that resonated with the promise of a future reborn from the ashes of the past. Miss Marple, as always, observed from the edge of the gathering, her hands resting gently on her lap, a faint, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The village, she mused, was like a garden. It needed care, attention, and the occasional weeding out of old wounds and regrets. And though she could not be sure that every mystery in St. Mary Mead had been solved, she knew this much: for now at least, things had been set right. Harriet's future, once uncertain, was now taking root in a way that promised growth, healing, and unity. As the applause faded, the soft hum of conversation resumed, the air filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. The garden party was beginning to settle into its rhythm, a night of celebration in the making. Yet, amid the joyous sounds, Miss Marple remained still, her delicate teacup cradled in her hands. But if one were to look closely, they would notice that the tea was not entirely tea. It was perhaps just a touch of champagne mixed in, a small indulgence on this rare occasion. After all, justice had been served, and she saw no harm in enjoying a moment of personal pleasure. The village, once torn apart by suspicion, was now healing, its people united by the shared understanding that they had been too quick to judge. Even Mrs. Abery, who had once been Harriet's loudest critic, now fawned over her as if they had always been friends, her earlier accusations forgotten. Miss Marple smiled faintly into her cup, the corners of her lips curling with quiet amusement. It was, she thought, a peculiar form of justice, but justice nonetheless. As her eyes turned toward Harriet, still near the rose garden, now speaking with Mr. Purton, Miss Marple saw it, a lightness in Harriet's expression, a peacefulness that had been absent for so long. It wasn't just the unmasking of the murderer that had brought this peace, it was the restoration of Harriet's life, the reclaiming of a future that had once been lost in the shadows of doubt. The Harding family's bitter feuds, their tangled history of resentment and division, had finally been unraveled. The long shadows that had once loomed over the village were now nothing more than memories, leaving room for the promise of new beginnings. The evening stretched on, the music and laughter blending into the soft hum of a community finally at peace with itself. And Miss Marple, for all her quiet wisdom and discretion, couldn't help but feel a rare sense of contentment. In her own way, she had been part of the healing. Justice, after all, was not always about the grand reveals or the dramatic moments of truth. Sometimes, it was about the quiet restoration of what had been lost, one small step at a time. For now at least, things had been set to rights. The whispered accusations that had once shrouded the village in a veil of mistrust had finally fallen silent, their echoes fading into the cool night air. The fears of inheritance disputes and long-held grudges, once haunting the next generation like ghostly specters, had been exorcised, their shadows cast aside by the truth's undeniable revelation. Barnaby Green's vengeful plot, twisted and cunning, had been exposed for what it truly was, a desperate attempt to manipulate the past and secure his own gain. And with the unmasking of Mr. Alderton's chilling crimes, the dark web of deceit he had spun, and the innocent lives he had nearly destroyed, any remnants of the village's troubled history were buried for good. Harriet Finch, a woman who had once faced the gallows for a crime she did not commit, now stood at the precipice of a bright new future, her past nothing more than a shadow that could no longer touch her. Miss Marple, who had watched this drama unfold with her characteristic calm and unshakable clarity, felt a rare and deep sense of closure. The truth had been revealed, and with it, justice had been served. The evening air, cool and crisp, seemed to carry a weight of peace that was both palpable and deeply satisfying. As Miss Marple settled into her chair, her teacup cradled between her hands, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The cases she had solved, the injustices she had corrected, they had been many, but none quite like this. Tonight, she could finally rest easy, knowing that the village she had come to love had found its balance once more. The long twisting road of deception and confusion had reached its end, and St. Mary Mead, like a garden that had been pruned and tended, was now poised for a new chapter. Tomorrow, no doubt, would bring new challenges, another mystery to solve, a missing cat perhaps, or a neighbor's quarrel to untangle. But for tonight, she would not think of those things. She would allow herself the small indulgence of savoring the present, the now, when all was right with the world. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she took a final sip of her tea, a little lighter, a little warmer. Across the garden, Harriet stood amidst a circle of friends, laughing freely, her face aglow with the kind of joy that had once seemed impossible. The villagers, who had once cast judgment so freely, now stood united, the old wounds of suspicion and doubt forgotten, swept away by the winds of truth and forgiveness. And there, beneath the soft glow of the garden lanterns, as the first of the fireworks soared into the sky, Miss Marple found herself truly content for the first time in weeks. The past had been laid to rest, and the future, once uncertain, was now bright with possibility. As the fireworks exploded in a cascade of brilliant colors above, Miss Marple raised her glass in a silent toast, her heart swelling with quiet satisfaction. The orchard, the symbol of healing and renewal, was no longer just an idea. It was a promise, a living, growing testament to the village's ability to move forward together. And as the night stretched on, filled with music, laughter, and the sweet promise of new beginnings, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles, her gaze drifting to Harriet, who stood near the dance floor, bathed in the light of the fireworks. For all the mysteries she had unraveled, for all the lives she had touched, it was this moment of peace, of unity, of quiet justice, that was the true reward. The night had fallen into a serene silence, the once lively garden party now a distant memory, with only the faint hum of the cool summer breeze brushing against the gently swaying lanterns left behind to mark its passing. The villagers of St. Mary Mead, their spirits lifted by the revelry, had drifted back to their homes, leaving the streets calm and still, as if the entire village had exhaled in unison, releasing the tension of the past few weeks. The echoes of laughter and music faded into the air, carried away by the night, leaving only the soft glow of the lanterns to illuminate the quiet streets. Miss Agatha Marple, ever the practical soul, politely declined the offer of a carriage, preferring instead the peace of a late-night stroll through the cobblestone streets. Her sensible shoes clicked rhythmically against the stones, a steady metronome in the quiet, as if marking the passage of time itself. The night air was cool and refreshing, carrying with it a hint of earthiness from the distant fields and the gentle scent of the garden flowers. There was something about these late evening walks that soothed her, time to reflect, time to let the events of the day settle in her mind like the quiet ripples of a pond. She had seen so much in her years, so many secrets unraveled, so many truths laid bare, and yet the mysteries never ceased to surprise her. Injustice had often seemed an inevitable part of the world, yet in time, she had learned that justice, too, had a way of finding its balance. It was much like a tangled skein of wool, each knot a story, each twist and turn a puzzle waiting to be solved. With patience, a steady hand and a mind that knew how to untangle the knots, everything could be set right again. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the air had grown cooler, and the full moon hung low over the rooftops, casting its silver glow across the village. She stepped inside, greeted by the comforting warmth of her sitting room, where the fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the room with its golden light. The familiar scent of old books, polished wood, and lavender lingered in the air. Her knitting basket sat neatly beside the fire, and the rhythmic sound of the yarn winding itself around the needles was a soothing companion to the silence of the room. Miss Marple placed her gloves on the table, smoothing her skirt as she settled into the chair, a deep sigh of contentment escaping her lips. The case had been resolved, Harriet Finch was free, and the village could breathe easy once more. The orchard, a symbol of renewal and growth, would soon flourish where feuds and grudges had once poisoned the air. For now at least, all was as it should be. But as she reached for her knitting needles, her eyes fell on something unusual on the side table, a letter, its envelope marked with the seal of a distant town. A letter at this hour. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow in mild curiosity. She hadn't been expecting any correspondence. With practiced ease, she unfolded the letter, her sharp eyes scanning the elegant handwriting that filled the page. "My dearest Miss Marple," it began, "I trust this letter finds you well. I write to you in what I can only describe as a most unusual predicament, one I believe will pique your interest." Miss Marple's lips curved into a small smile, amused and intrigued. Another mystery, it seemed, was on the horizon. She set the letter aside for a moment, her mind already running through the possibilities, and then reached for her tea. The warmth of the cup felt comforting in her hands, though she had already begun to set her thoughts in motion, as she always did when confronted with the unknown. The letter had piqued her interest, but she had learned long ago to take her time. Mysteries, after all, rarely revealed themselves quickly. There was always a hidden layer beneath the surface, and it was that hidden layer that Miss Marple excelled at uncovering. She allowed herself a small knowing smile as she resumed her knitting, content in the knowledge that she would once again be called upon. No matter where she went, or how many mysteries she solved, there would always be more waiting to be discovered. In every town, in every village, in every corner of the world, secrets waited to be uncovered, and Miss Marple, with her calm demeanor and sharp mind, would always be ready to unravel them. Outside, the fireplace crackled softly, its warmth a welcome companion to the cool night air that whispered through the open window. The stars above twinkled in the dark sky, watching over the village, their ancient light casting a sense of knowing, as if they too had witnessed the endless cycle of mysteries and revelations. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her thoughts turning once more to the letter. It had been a good evening, a satisfying resolution to the case that had gripped the village. Harriet Finch had been vindicated, and the orchard would grow as a symbol of peace and renewal, but there was always more, always another mystery on the horizon. With one last contented smile, Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to savor the quiet satisfaction of a case well done, knowing that no matter what the future held, she would always be ready for the next mystery to come.